You ever smell fresh paint and wet dirt at the same time and just know something's wrong? The scent hit me before I even stepped out of my truck. Sharp latex. Damp soil. And something else, splintered cedar baking under a rising Texas sun. I killed the engine and just sat there for a second. The silence felt completely off. Too clean. No familiar creak of old timber resisting the wind. No low, rhythmic rumble from the Longhorns. Just the dry breeze sliding across open ground where something massive used to stand. I stepped out, and my boots sank half an inch into soft, churned dirt that hadn't been there yesterday. My barn was gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Gone. Flat and clean like it had never existed in the first place. The hand-hewn cedar boards were stacked off to the side in neat, indifferent piles, sorted by length like they were lumberyard stock. Heavy iron hinges, twisted loose from the main posts, were tossed into the weeds like scrap metal. The heavy gate I'd welded myself lay face down in the mud, still faint with the smell of burnt steel and gear oil. 20 Longhorns stood behind a flimsy, temporary wire fence someone had thrown up overnight. They shifted uneasily, their hooves pressing deep into unfamiliar ground, their massive horns catching the morning light like curved blades of polished ivory. One of them snorted, kicking up a small cloud of red dust. Another stomped. They knew the geometry of their world had been altered while they slept. I walked forward slowly, every step measured, every breath steady. The air still held the invisible hum of diesel engines that had already left the scene. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the hydraulic whine in my head. The grind of the tracks. The relentless hydraulic push. The final, agonizing crack when the main frame gave out. And then I saw it. A bright white notice, enclosed in weather-resistant plastic, stapled neatly to a broken remaining post. HOA Violation Notice. Section 4, Paragraph B, Aesthetic Disruption of Public Corridors. Failure to comply with the annual Heritage Parade visual standards. Emergency abatement enforced. I read it twice. Then once more. Just to make sure the bureaucratic arrogance was as stupid as it sounded. Behind me, the sound of premium tires rolling over gravel broke the silence. A black, pristine SUV eased up to the boundary line like it already owned the deed to the dirt. Victoria Langford stepped out, her heels clicking cleanly on the stones without looking at me. Oversized sunglasses. Perfect, unyielding posture. A heavy aluminum clipboard held tight in her hand like it was a shield of absolute authority. She scanned my pasture with a look of clinical satisfaction, like she just personally improved the county. "We had to act quickly," she said. Her voice didn't have an ounce of hesitation, the same tone she probably used to discuss municipal lawn care budgets. "Your structure didn't align with the visual standards for this weekend's Centennial Parade. The county inspectors agreed it posed an immediate visual hazard to the television broadcast route." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the massive, empty square of sky where my grandfather's barn used to cast a deep blue shade every afternoon. The ground still held the outline, darker, cooler soil that hadn't seen direct sunlight since 1948. It looked like a fresh scar that hadn't figured out how to stop bleeding yet. "You'll receive the itemized invoice by mail," she added, already pivoting on her heel back toward her idling vehicle. "Demolition. Site compliance. Administrative enforcement fees. Cleanup." I let that word sit in my mouth for a second. It tasted like limestone dust and old iron. The wind shifted, blowing a gust of warm air from the south. One of the old steers let out a low, restless call that vibrated through the floorboards of her SUV. Victoria paused just long enough to glance at their long, sweeping horns, then snapped her gaze back to me. "You might want to keep those things tightly contained," she said, pointing her pen toward the flimsy wire. "We can't have any unscripted disruptions during a $1 million community event. The network cameras won't tolerate it." I nodded once. Slow. Calm. Like I was agreeing with every syllable. "The parade's still running the exact same historical route this year, right? Right along the old easement road?" She smiled, a quick flash of white teeth without a hint of warmth. Of course it is. It's the centerpiece of the whole development. Then she drove off, her tires crunching over the very gravel that used to lead to my barn door. I stood there a little longer, breathing in the remnants of the paint, the wet dirt, and something underneath it all. Something older. Something patient. I turned, walked to the temporary fence line, and rested my bare hand against the cold, thin wire. 20 sets of dark eyes shifted toward me in unison. Waiting. Listening. I gave them a small nod. All right, I said under my breath, the metal wire vibrating beneath my palm. Let's see how perfect they like it. I didn't rebuild the fence right away. In fact, I didn't touch a single post. I left the perimeter exactly how her contracted crew had left it, crooked, rushed, and completely temporary. Just enough cheap wire and shallow cedar T-posts to keep 20 head of cattle from wandering onto the asphalt before the weekend. The ground stayed unusually soft for days. If you looked closely at the margin between my pasture and the new suburban curb, you could still see the deep track marks from the skid steers pressed 3 inches into the soil. Wide, aggressive treads. Fresh. They hadn't even bothered to smooth over the ruts. They figured a Texas landowner would either scream, call a lawyer, or spend his own money fixing their mess. They didn't expect silence. Every morning at dawn, I walked the exact same path where the barn walls used to stand. Same number of paces from the old wellhead. Same long pause near the center where the great white oak support beam had been anchored. I could still feel the phantom weight of the building in my boots. The ground remembered it, even if the HOA's ledger didn't. My dad had taught me how to weld on the frame of that old gate when I was 12. He told me that out here, the dirt doesn't care about paper. It only cares about water and weight. Victoria and her board had used an obscure emergency abatement loophole, a piece of fine print slipped into the subdivision charter 5 years ago when the developers bought the old Miller orchard. Next door, they claimed an old, unpainted barn within 50 feet of the public right-of-way was an attractive nuisance. They thought they were playing chess with a man who only understood dirt. The Longhorns stayed restless through Wednesday. They paced the northern line more than usual, their heavy hooves grinding the dry clover into dust that hadn't settled. Their horns caught on the cheap, uninsulated wire sometimes, creating a sharp, metallic ping that echoed too long across the open pasture. I didn't fix that either. I let the sound carry. Let it repeat. Let it become the new rhythm of the corner lot. By Thursday morning, the glossy flyers started showing up on every black-painted mailbox down the road. Bright, saturated colors. Bold serif lettering, the 75th Annual Heritage and Progress Parade. The corporate sponsors were listed across the bottom like a row of expensive promises. Local banks, luxury car dealerships, real estate firms that sold ranch living without the smell of manure. I picked one up off the gravel near my mailbox. The glossy paper still smelled like fresh press ink and chemical gloss. They were incredibly proud of it. $1 million floats imported from New Orleans. 3 high school marching bands from Dallas. A full troop of mounted sheriffs on groomed quarter horses. I flipped the flyer over slowly. The route map was printed clean and simple on the back. A long, sweeping loop that cut right through the heart of the new subdivision, winding along the manicured greenbelts, and then, right along the western edge of my property line. Not near it. Not across the street. Directly against the temporary fence. I folded the paper once, creasing the shiny image of a stylized Longhorn logo, and slid it into my denim jacket pocket. That night, well after the neighborhood lights had gone dark behind their plantation shutters, I walked out to the irrigation control shed. It sat a quarter-mile past the old barn site, hidden inside a thick motte of live oaks that the developers had missed. The heavy brass padlock clicked open with a dull, heavy sound I'd heard thousands of times before. Inside, the air was 10 degrees cooler. Damp. It carried that rich, mineral scent of deep groundwater and ancient rusted steel. Rows of massive manual valves lined the concrete wall like the levers of an old locomotive. The main pressure gauges sat perfectly still at 0, waiting for the seasonal release. I ran my calloused hand along the primary 8-inch discharge pipe. Solid. Cold. Unyielding. This private irrigation system had been tapping into the Trinity Aquifer long before the first surveyor mapped out these cul-de-sacs. Longer than their roads. Longer than their deed restrictions. Victoria's office had sent a dozen notices over the years asking to buy out the water rights to feed their neighborhood water features and automated sprinklers. They just never realized who actually maintained the main pressure line that ran directly beneath the parade route's new asphalt. They never asked because the water always flowed when they turned their taps. Back out at the fence line, one of the steers nudged the wire again. Another sharp ping cut through the midnight air. I looked out toward the cluster of million-dollar homes in the distance. Perfect rows of identical gables. Clean, square edges. Everything trimmed, sodded, and controlled. Just the way Victoria liked it. I could still hear her voice rattling around in the dark. We can't have any unscripted disruptions. I let out a slow, quiet breath through my nose. Then I turned on my flashlight and checked the manual schedule taped inside the steel door of the shed. Water release cycles. Pressure variances. Emergency override protocols. All written in my father's neat, drafting pen handwriting. I traced Saturday's date with my thumb. Same day. Same 3-hour time window as the television broadcast. I closed the iron panel gently, letting the latch drop without a sound. There was no rush here. No anger. Just a simple matter of hydraulic timing. The morning of the parade arrived far quieter than I expected. There wasn't any wind to speak of, and the local birds seemed to have moved further timberward to escape the noise. Just a flat, pale stretch of Texas sky turning from bruised purple to an unkind gray over the limestone rooflines. I was already awake and sitting on the hood of my old Ford before the first orange sunbeam hit the dirt. My coffee sat untouched in a stained thermos next to me, its steam disappearing quickly into the crisp morning air. The Longhorns were dead still. Too still. They stood in a loose, single-file line along the temporary wire fence, all 20 of them facing the asphalt road like they could feel a low-frequency vibration coming long before it actually hit the valley. By 7 o'clock I checked my watch. Then I looked out toward the suburban entrance. Lights flickered on in sequence. Garage doors lifted with a collective, distant groan. Custom pickup trucks and German station wagons started engines. You could hear the early, synchronized rhythm of the community building itself up for the show. It was organized, disciplined, and entirely managed. Exactly how they spent 8 months planning it. I walked the perimeter of the temporary fence one last time. Same weak cedar posts. Same thin, 16-gauge wire held together by staples that hadn't been driven home entirely. The crew had been in a hurry to finish before dark on Tuesday, and it showed. The posts were set barely 18 inches into the dirt. That detail mattered. Everything had to look untouched by human intervention. It had to look like an act of God, or at least an act of nature. I stopped near the southwest corner, the point closest to where the parade floats would make their final turn before heading toward the main grandstand. From here, I could see the orange plastic barricades being set up by volunteers in matching green polo shirts. They laughed, waved to early rising neighbors, and adjusted their clipboards. Someone tested a high-powered speaker system near the intersection. A blast of classic country music cracked through the valley, then died out just as quickly into static. The Longhorns shifted behind me at the sound. Their hooves pressed into the top layer of soil that looked completely dry and dusty on top but remained dangerously saturated 3 inches down. One of the older steers exhaled a hard, wet breath that plumed in the cool air. I reached down and scooped up a handful of the dirt near the corner post. It broke apart easily enough in my fingers, but when I squeezed it, it left a dark, greasy smear of clay across my palm. The underground pressure line had been weeping silently since 3 o'clock this morning. Not enough to flood the surface. Not enough to create a noticeable puddle that a volunteer would spot. Just a steady, subterranean saturation that turned the underlying clay bed into something resembling gray grease. I wiped my hand on my jeans and walked back to the irrigation shed for the final adjustment. The heavy iron wheel of the bypass valve felt cold and heavy in my grip. I didn't open it all the way, that would have blown the main line and torn up the street. I just cracked it open 3 full turns. A controlled leak. A localized pressure surge that would find the weakest path of resistance, which happened to be the uncompacted trench the HOA's contractors had dug to install their neighborhood utility lines right next to my pasture. When I stepped back outside, the sun was fully up. The neighborhood was alive with sound. Hundreds of lawn chairs lined the curbs across the street. Children held small plastic flags, and the smell of high-dollar brisket smokers drifted across the blacktop. It smelled sweet, smoky, and entirely intentional. I walked back to my truck, leaned against the side mirror, and watched the first grand float appear at the far end of the boulevard. It was a massive, multi-tiered creation covered in fake white roses and silver tinsel, carrying the town's high school royalty. The music from the marching band behind it was loud enough to make the change in the air feel physical. I looked down at my watch. The minutes were lining up perfectly with the hydraulic calculations. The water was moving where it wanted to move. No alarms were sounding in the municipal office because the main system was still technically within bounds. It was just physics doing what physics was designed to do when men forgot to look below the surface. The music grew into a steady, thumping roar as the second float rolled past the entrance of my land. This one was a flatbed carrying a regional corporate sponsor, complete with a 5-piece brass band whose horns caught the mid-morning sun like golden discs. The bass drum beat echoed off the limestone houses opposite us, bounced back across the asphalt, and struck the pasture like a physical slap. The Longhorns didn't run, but their bodies went completely rigid. Heads snapped up. Massive, 5-foot horn spans turned toward the noise in a slow, synchronized movement. They weren't panicked yet, but they were highly alert, their wild cattle instincts trying to categorize the sudden wall of sound. I checked my watch again. 10:15. The soil near the third fence post began to change color. To anyone sitting 30 feet away in a folding chair, it looked like nothing more than a passing shadow from a mesquite tree. But from where I stood, I could see the tiny, rhythmic bubbles of air rising through the red clay at the base of the wood. The water wasn't rushing out. It was gently welling up from the pressurized line below, turning the dry crust into a deep, unstable soup. The third float, a massive replica of an old pioneer log cabin built on a triple-axle trailer, slowed down as it hit the curve. The driver was navigating carefully, keeping the heavy rig exactly centered between the white-painted lines of the new road. The spectators cheered, throwing plastic beads and candy toward the kids on the sidewalks. Behind the wire, my lead steer, a 20-year-old animal with a horn spread that could clear a garage door, took 2 steps closer to the noise. He was curious about the bright red streamers fluttering from the side of the trailer. His massive front hooves, each the size of a dinner plate, sank 3 inches into the softened clay near the fence line. The moment his weight shifted forward, the third cedar post groaned. It didn't snap. It just tilted 3 degrees to the west, its shallow base sliding smoothly through the liquefied earth like a spoon through warm lard. The wire between the third and fourth posts went taut, making a distinct thrumming sound that was instantly swallowed by the high school drumline approaching from behind the cabin float. I didn't move an inch. My hands stayed tucked into my pockets, my breathing as regular as a clock. This wasn't a riot, it was just a series of small, logical consequences unfolding exactly as they had to. If you take away a barn that has stood for 70 years to clear a camera angle, you change how the wind moves. If you dig a hasty trench and don't tamp the clay back down, you create a sponge. Another steer moved up beside the leader, his long horn nearly brushing the wire. The extra 400 pounds of pressure was all the fence needed. The fourth post gave way next, leaning over at a lazy, drunken angle. The top strand of barbed wire, the old wire I'd warned the crew not to reuse, slipped its staple with a sharp ping that sounded like a rifle shot to anyone listening closely. The volunteer in the green polo shirt stationed at the intersection looked over his shoulder for a split second. He saw the leaning posts, but his brain didn't register what it meant. He didn't see the water weeping into the ditch, He just saw a couple of cows standing near an old fence. He turned back to wave at the fire truck that was next in line, its sirens giving a short, celebratory yelp. The drumline was directly opposite the pasture now. 30 high schoolers hitting brass-rimmed snare drums in perfect, military unison. The vibration was immense. It shook the glass in my truck mirrors. It shook the water in the ditch. And it shook the last bit of resolve out of the temporary fence line. The fifth post dropped 6 inches deeper into the mud as the earth beneath it completely liquefied. The wire didn't break. It simply sagged until it was resting flat against the green clover, creating a perfect, unencumbered ramp from the red dirt of my pasture straight onto the pristine, black asphalt of the newly christened Heritage Boulevard. The old lead steer didn't run through the gap. He was too old and too dignified for that. He simply stood there for 3 long seconds, his dark eyes watching the tinsel-covered fire truck roll past at 5 miles an hour. He noticed the wire was no longer pressing against his chest. He noticed the red clay gave way to something solid, flat, and wide open. With a slow, deliberate swing of his head, he stepped over the sunken wire. His front hooves hit the clean blacktop with a sharp, hollow clack-clack that was entirely different from the sound of the dirt. Behind him, 19 more Longhorns followed in perfect, single-file order. They didn't charge. They didn't bellow. They moved with the quiet, crushing weight of an old Texas river current changing its course because the levee had decayed. The transition from a managed civic event to a historic cattle drive took less than 30 seconds. A kid on the opposite side of the street was the first to stop waving his flag. His hand just stayed frozen in the air, his mouth dropping open as 20 pairs of horns, some spanning 6 feet from tip to tip, entered the parade route directly behind the high school marching band. A mother 3 chairs down grabbed her toddler by the overall straps and pulled him backward into her lap without taking her eyes off the herd. The laughter along that section of the sidewalk died out in a neat, sweeping wave, replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness that had nothing to do with the music. The fire truck driver looked in his side mirror and immediately hit his brakes. The air brakes gave a massive, loud pff that caused the steers to pause. They didn't scatter. They just grouped up closer together, their long, dangerous horns forming a moving forest of bone and hide right in the middle of the 2-lane road. The marching band, entirely unaware of what had joined their formation from behind, kept playing their fight song for another 20 yards before the drum major finally turned around to signal a halt. His baton stayed raised in the air as he looked down the line and realized his flute section was now sharing the right-of-way with 10 tons of open-range livestock. I leaned my back against the side of my Ford, crossed my ankles, and took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee. My part in the script was completely finished. The valve was set, the physics had resolved, and the rest of the morning belonged entirely to the community's capacity for spontaneous adaptation. The announcer's voice came over the main loudspeaker system from 300 yards away down the street. He was sitting in a raised wooden booth, reading from a pre-approved script about the pioneering spirit of our founders. And next up on our historic route, folks, we have the speaker gave a loud burst of electronic feedback as the man's microphone dipped. You could hear him shuffling papers frantically in the background. We appear to have an unscheduled historical display entering the main corridor from the western sector. Please remain in your seats while our event coordinators adjust the schedule. A volunteer in a green polo shirt came running down the center of the road, his face the exact color of the white tinsel on the floats. He was waving his aluminum clipboard at the lead steer like it was a stop sign. The old steer didn't even blink. He just kept walking forward at his steady, 2-mile-an-hour trail pace, his left horn passing exactly 3 inches above the hood of a parked BMW. The volunteer stopped running, took 2 steps backward into a hedge, and let his clipboard drop to the ground. By 11 o'clock, the parade had completely lost its linear structure, but it had gained something far more interesting. It had become a slow, defensive dance between high-dollar organization and 500 years of specialized genetics. Victoria Langford appeared at the edge of the intersection 5 minutes later. Her pristine white pantsuit was spotless, but her movements were no longer the calculated, smooth motions of a woman who ran a board meeting. She was walking in short, aggressive strides, her cell phone pressed hard against her ear as she spoke to someone in the municipal office. "I don't care about the water pressure," she screamed over the sound of the idling fire engine. "I've got 20 unpermitted animals standing directly in front of the television unit. Where is the county wrangler? What do you mean he's at the county fair in Belton?" She hung up, her chest heaving as she looked across the road. Her eyes followed the line of the herd, past the stalled fire truck, past the high school band that had retreated safely onto a resident's front lawn, all the way back to the fence line. She saw the tilted posts. She saw the gray mud bubbling around the base of the wood. And then, finally, her gaze landed on me. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just lifted my thermos in a quiet, polite toast from the hood of my truck. She walked over to the edge of my property, her expensive leather shoes sinking instantly into the red mud near the curb. She stopped exactly where the dry ground ended and the wet clay began, her face tight with an anger that was trying desperately to look like administrative authority. "Your fence failed," she said. Her voice was shaking slightly, though she was doing her best to keep it under wraps. "You're liable for this. Every single minute this broadcast is delayed is going to be billed to your estate." I let the truck engine idle behind me before I answered. "My fence didn't fail, Victoria. Your crew put that wire up on Tuesday after they tore down 60 cubits of seasoned oak heartwood. I didn't touch a single nail of it. I figured an HOA-approved fence was built to last at least through the weekend." She looked down at the mud around her shoes, then out toward the main water marker at the edge of the pasture. She wasn't a stupid woman. She knew how the water lines ran in this valley. She could see the steady, quiet wealth of gray water rising through the ruts her own machines had left behind. "You did this," she whispered, her voice dropping below the noise of the crowd. "You opened the old agricultural bypass. The county records show that line has a mandatory seasonal pressure release every third Saturday of October," I said, my voice completely level. "It's been in the deed since 1952. Your developers just forgot to check the historical easements before they laid down the asphalt on top of the old clay bed. If your contractors hadn't stripped the topsoil off my drainage line to make your parade route look prettier, that water would have gone right into the creek like it always does." She stood there for a long time, the sound of her cell phone buzzing in her hand ignored. Down the street, the situation had reached a strange sort of equilibrium. The Longhorns had found a large patch of manicured St. Augustine grass on the median and had collectively decided it tasted better than the dry clover in the pasture. They were currently grazing in a neat circle around a real estate sign, their massive horns occasionally clicking against the metal frame with that same sharp ping I'd been hearing all week. The crowd wasn't running away anymore. In fact, most of the fathers had stepped down off the curbs with their phones out, taking pictures of their kids with the massive steers in the background. The marching band had started playing again from the lawn, not their military march, but a loose, improvisational blues tune that fit the heat of the noon sun. The illusion of total, unyielding control had softened into something human, something that looked a whole lot like Texas before the developers bought the dirt. The afternoon sun hit its peak by 2 o'clock, turning the blacktop into a shimmering mirror of heat waves. The parade hadn't officially ended, but the corporate sponsors had already packed up their banners and gone home. What remained was a slow, managed retreat. The county sheriff's department had finally sent 2 older deputies in an unmarked unit. They didn't bring ropes or cattle prods. They just parked their truck across the northern lane, put their hats on, and sat on the tailgate eating brisket sandwiches they'd bought from one of the local vendors. They knew Longhorns. They knew that if you don't chase them, they'll eventually go back to where the water is. Victoria Langford was gone. Her black SUV had backed down the Eastman Road an hour ago after the network producer told her they were switching the broadcast feed to a high school game in Plano because the cattle incident didn't fit their family programming profile. Her clipboard was left sitting on the hood of a volunteer's golf cart, its pages of rules fluttering in the dry southern breeze. I walked down to the edge of the asphalt and gave a short, sharp whistle through my teeth. The old lead steer stopped chewing his mouth full of premium sod, lifted his massive head, and looked at me across the 2 lanes of ruined parade route. He gave a short snort, turned his body around with a slow, heavy grace, and began the long walk back toward the pasture gap. The other 19 followed him without a single deviation. They stepped over the flattened wire, their hooves sinking back into the familiar red mud of my land, and moved out toward the shade of the live oaks near the wellhead. They didn't look back at the suburban street, and they didn't look at the plastic flags melting in the heat against the curbs. I walked over to the irrigation box one last time, turned the iron wheel back until the gauge dropped cleanly to 0, and listened to the silence return to the pipes. The ground would be dry by tomorrow morning. The clay would harden back into something like concrete, locking the crooked cedar posts into their new, permanent slant. When I got back to my truck, the neighborhood was completely quiet again. The lawn chairs were gone. The orange barricades were stacked by the fire station. The only sign that anything had happened at all was a 200-yard stretch of manicured sod that had been chewed down to the roots and a few deep ruts of red Texas mud smeared across the premium asphalt of Heritage Boulevard. I started the Ford, the old V8 engine giving a low, reassuring rumble that felt solid under my feet. I looked out at the empty space where my grandfather's barn used to stand. The scar was still there, but it didn't look quite as deep as it had at sunrise. I put the truck in gear and backed down the drive, the gravel crunching under my tires with a steady, predictable rhythm. "Let's see how they like it next year," I said to the empty cab, and drove out onto the highway before the county trucks could even arrive to sweep up the mess.